I wasn't expecting much when I knocked on that barn door. Just another quiet afternoon in Tennessee. A neighbor told me an old man down the road had a few wood carvings worth seeing. Nothing fancy, just real. The barn sat behind a weather-worn house. White paint peeling, roof patched in 3 different colors. But what caught my eye was the stillness. No dog, no radio, no movement. Just the wind brushing through the cedar trees and the faint smell of oak and oil. Then the door creaked open. He didn't say a word, just looked at me, gray eyes, strong posture for someone his age, and motioned for me to come in. The inside of the shop was like walking into a different world. Not loud, not dusty, not cluttered. Everything was placed. Not neat, but intentional. Like every tool had been used enough to earn its spot, but not so often that it had lost its story. The air smelled like thyme, wood shavings, metal, and a little bit of pipe tobacco, long since cold. The light came in through slatted windows, soft and golden, landing perfectly on a half-finished piece near the back. Tools hung like memories on the wall. A lathe that had seen more seasons than I had birthdays. Stacks of wood that had clearly been chosen, not collected. And then I saw it. A sculpture in the corner. Not tall, not shiny. Just a block of aged walnut, carved into the shape of folded wings. Nothing fancy, nothing grand. But there was something about the way it stood, like it had been waiting. It looked unfinished, but deliberate, like whoever made it had more to say, but didn't need to say it right now. I turned to the old man. He hadn't said a word yet, just watched me look. "You make all of these?" I asked. He nodded once. Then after a pause, he added softly, "After the war, this was the only thing that ever made sense." That was the first thing he said, and it stopped me cold. Because in his voice, there wasn't pride, there wasn't pain, there was weight. The kind of weight men carry quietly for decades. The kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice. I didn't know it then, but that would be the start of one of the most meaningful afternoons I've ever had. A lesson in stillness and the quiet strength of carving your life, one cut at a time. His name was Samuel. He told me that about an hour in, after I'd already seen half his shop and listened to the creak of the floorboards more than his voice. He didn't offer his last name, didn't need to. In a town like ours, men like him don't need introductions. They're known by the stories others whisper, not the ones they tell themselves. Samuel was 72. He'd retired from the Marines at 51. But you could tell he never really left. Everything about him was measured. The way he moved, the way he held his tools, the way he stood still, not out of weakness, but by choice. He had that posture some soldiers keep long after the war is over. Back straight, shoulders square, eyes that have seen too much, but won't burden you with it. He lived alone. Had for over 20 years. His wife, Lorraine, had passed from cancer the same year he left the Corps. He never remarried, didn't have kids, didn't talk much about family, except to say, "They're not around." I asked once if he ever thought about leaving town. He just shrugged. "This is where the trees know me," he said. It was the kind of answer that sounded simple, until you sat with it for a while. Samuel's workshop wasn't a place where things were made quickly. It was where time slowed down, and grief had room to breathe. He didn't sell his carvings, didn't have a website, no social media, no business cards. People came, they looked. Some offered to buy. He usually said no. "I don't carve to fill shelves," he told me one morning. "I carve to empty what's left in me." And once you understood that, really understood it, you started seeing his work differently. It wasn't decorative, it was devotional. His carvings weren't loud, they didn't demand attention. But when you stood close enough, you felt something steady, like a voice under the surface saying, "I'm still here." It took me a while to realize Samuel hadn't chosen silence because he had nothing to say. He'd chosen it because he'd already said it. In oak, in walnut, in every grain that still held his breath. It sat in the darkest part of the shop, tucked behind a stack of cedar, half covered by an old wool blanket. Forgotten, but not forgotten. The kind of log that doesn't just sit there, it waits. I'd passed it a dozen times, always assuming it was firewood or too far gone to be worth the work. But one morning, I found Samuel standing beside it, blanket pulled off, sleeves rolled, tools already laid out. He didn't look at me, didn't nod, just stared at the log like it had said something only he could hear. I asked gently, "What's this one for?" He paused, then said, "This one's been with me a long time. I just never had the hands steady enough. Until now." There was no design, no sketch. He didn't trace anything on the surface, just picked up the mallet and gouge, and began. The first cut wasn't just deep, it was deliberate, like that blade had been waiting years to move. Each strike had weight, not force, but meaning. And I realized he wasn't carving a figure. He was carving through something. Grief, maybe. Memory. Something that had outlived words. I didn't ask questions after that. I just watched. And the more I watched, the more I understood. Sometimes the hardest thing a man can do is begin. It made me think, how many of us have something we've carried too long? A log we've been afraid to touch? A story we keep in the corner, covered in dust? Samuel never said what this piece would become, but I saw it in his eyes. He didn't need to know the final shape. He just needed to let it start becoming. And maybe you've got something like that too. Maybe there's a cut you haven't made yet. A silence you've been keeping. Something too heavy to say, but too true to bury. If this part of Samuel's story speaks to something in you, I'd be honored to hear it. You'll find space in the comments below. And if you missed the last part, the man behind the silence, it's in the description. That's where we first began to understand why Samuel carves at all. You'll also find a note down there on how to support this quiet series. And maybe share your own story, if you've got one. We're not here to make noise. We're here to carve through what matters. One cut at a time. He carved like a man writing letters to someone who would never read them. There was a rhythm to it. Slow, precise, deliberate. No sketch, no hesitation. Just memory in motion. The grain of the log began to split open, layer by layer. And as it did, something in Samuel opened too. He never said a word, didn't hum, didn't sigh. But every few minutes, he'd stop and rest his hand on the wood, like he was listening for something beneath the surface. I sat nearby, quiet. Didn't dare interrupt. There was a heaviness in the room, not sad, not dark, just full of time, of things that had gone unsaid for decades, of ghosts that lived not in the house, but in the hands of the man who survived them. I noticed the way his left shoulder stiffened when he leaned into a curve, the way his fingers twitched when he pressed too deep, and the way his eyes sometimes glazed, not from exhaustion, but from somewhere far off, Vietnam. That's where he'd served. He never told me what he saw there, only that he came home quieter than when he left. One time he said, "The loudest part of war is what it leaves behind." And here he was, decades later, carving those echoes into oak. He wasn't chasing beauty. He wasn't trying to impress. He was translating something only he could hear, something only the wood would understand. There was one moment, mid-afternoon, light slanting through the window, where I watched a single curl of shavings fall from the chisel. It landed on the floor, soft as breath. And for just a second, Samuel paused. He looked at that shaving like it was a name, one he hadn't spoken since the jungle. He didn't cry, didn't falter. He just nodded and kept carving. Some men carry their past in boxes. Others bury it. Samuel? He carves it. Right there into the grain, where it can't be erased, but can finally rest. It was near sunset when it happened. The shop was quiet, like always. The only sound was the steady scrape of blade against oak, and the soft breath of a man deep in thought. Samuel was carving the jawline, something strong, defined, but worn with age. His left hand steadied the wood, his right moved the chisel in slow, sure strokes. He didn't rush. He never rushed. But still, the edge slipped, not far, just enough. A nick across the top of his hand. The cut wasn't deep, barely more than a scratch, but the blood rose anyway, slow and thin, and gathered at the wrist like it didn't quite remember how to flow. He didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't even reach for a rag at first. He just looked at it, still, calm, like someone watching a wave return after years of silence. I moved toward him. "You all right?" He blinked, looked up at me, eyes distant, like he hadn't been in the shop at all. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I remember this feeling." He didn't mean the pain. He meant the memory that followed it. His gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, I saw something shift in his face, like the weight of 1,000 forgotten moments was pressing down behind his eyes. He wiped the blood on an old cloth. "I used to wrap worse than this in duct tape and keep moving," he muttered. But it wasn't bravado. It was muscle memory, warrior's instinct. Then he said, more quietly, "Sometimes the body remembers what the mind tries to forget." He didn't carve the rest of that day. Instead, he sat at the workbench, hands folded, eyes on the sculpture. Not with frustration, not with anger, just acceptance. Some part of him had been pulled back, not fully, not dangerously, but just enough to remind him the past never leaves completely. It just waits. He cleaned the tools slowly, closed the shop just before the light left the windows, and as he walked out, he placed one hand gently on the dragon's brow, like a soldier checking the pulse of something still alive. He didn't say anything else, and he didn't need to. That night, The barn was darker than usual, but it wasn't empty. It was holding something, a memory, a scar. A man who had cut through pain for years, and just for a moment had remembered how much it still hurt. The next morning, Samuel was already in the shop. The bandage on his hand was simple: clean cloth, a strip of tape. He moved slower than before, but not weaker. There was a calmness in the way he approached the sculpture now. Not like he was fixing it, but like he was finishing something that needed to know it wasn't perfect. The cut across the brow of the dragon was still there. A thin, accidental groove, easily patchable, easily hidden. But Samuel didn't sand it, didn't fill it. He carved around it, turned it into a ridge, an old wound etched into the dragon's face like a mark of survival. Not damage, but history. This wasn't in the plan, he said, eyes focused. But maybe it was always supposed to be there. He didn't say it like a man making peace with a mistake. He said it like someone who had finally realized that scars are part of the shape. I sat with that idea for a while, watched him work, and I thought about how many men carry their stories like cracks in the skin, thinking they have to hide them, patch them, deny they were ever there. But Samuel? He let the wound speak. The sculpture came alive in those final days, not because it was flawless, but because it held everything: grief, resilience, fear, patience, and now, forgiveness. Forgiveness for time, for memory, for the man who couldn't always be strong, but never stopped standing. When the dragon was finally complete, it didn't look fierce. It looked wise, grounded, still. It stood not in flight, but in watch, not roaring, but remembering. And in that stillness, Samuel placed a message for anyone who looked long enough to see it. You're allowed to carry your scars. You're allowed to keep carving. That was the value he never wrote down, the one no one asked for. But every man who stepped into that shop would feel it. The idea that life wasn't about smoothing the rough edges, but about shaping them into something that could stand the weather. He ran a final hand over the dragon's brow, the place the blade had slipped, and whispered, "There. That's better." And it was, not because it was finished, but because it was honest. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to hear what it stirred up. You can find the earlier chapters, The Man Behind the Silence and The Dragon That Helped Him Breathe Again, in the playlist below. And in our next episode, we'll meet a man who carved a wooden flag for the son he lost in service. Not to mourn, but to remember. These stories aren't loud, but they last. So if you haven't yet, subscribe and keep walking with us. We carve slow here, one breath, one cut at a time.